Hello and welcome to this week's wrap-up, where we break down the most important stories shaping Ukraine's and the future of the world. This week we are looking at three major developments: why exporting defense technology could be the key to Ukraine's long-term security, Europe's evolving peacekeeping plans, and why Russia remains the biggest obstacle, Ukraine's tense relationships with the United States, and the possibility of Russian attack on Europe in the coming years. Let's dive in. For years, Ukraine has relied on Western aid to sustain its military, but now a new reality is setting in. Ukraine must take the lead in securing its own future. And one of the biggest ways to do that: expanding its defense industry through exports and partnerships. NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte put it bluntly: we need to produce more weaponry. We are lagging behind when you compare it to the Russians and other sides of the world. The world is waking up to the fact that arms production is a necessity not just for Ukraine, but for the entire Western alliance bloc. Ukraine is already proving itself in this field, while the US manufactures around 100,000 drones per year. Ukraine's private sector is producing over 3 million drones annually. That's not just impressive, it's a game changer. Ukrainian companies like Viri Drone and even developing fully Ukrainian-made FPV drones, cutting out reliance on Chinese components. And what next to happen? Full-scale procurement. Ukraine must streamline its defense procurement process to boost domestic production. Controlled exports, selling defense technology to allies, would lower production costs and bring much-needed revenue into Ukraine's economy. And strategic partnerships. Even the US is investing billions in drone technology, but American products are often expensive and underperforming in comparison to cost-effective alternatives. And Ukraine has the expertise to complement this effort, making a collaboration a win-win. As Ukraine fights for its future, Europe is stepping up with plans to send peacekeepers to Ukraine. But there is a problem. Peace requires a real agreement, and Russia isn't interested in it at all. At a Paris summit on March 27th, French President Macron and UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer outlined their vision for a reassurance force that would deter Russian aggression. Starmer made it clear this is a deal that is going to be defended. But there are some challenges ahead. Moscow is filibustering peace negotiations. It keeps adding new demands, including the lifting of sanctions permanently. The US is struggling to broker a peace deal too, as Ukraine agreed to a 30-day ceasefire proposal, but Russia has only agreed to partial measures and continues to strike Ukraine with drones. And European unity is fragile. Italy is skeptical about sending troops, and Poland hasn't fully committed either. With all these challenges on their ground and growing threat of the Russian invasion of other European countries, we are facing a political and defense crisis in the old Europe. For years, Ukraine has been the primary battlefield, but new intelligence reports indicate that Vladimir Putin's ambitions stretch far beyond its borders. According to the assessments from German and Lithuanian intelligence, Moscow is gearing up for a larger conventional war by the end of this decade. The Lithuanian intelligence service states that while Russia may not yet have the capacity for a full-scale war against NATO, limited military aggression against one or more NATO countries is entirely possible. Imagine which country it would be. This isn't just a speculation, it's a calculated strategy. The Kremlin may attempt to test NATO's commitment to Article 5, which guarantees mutual defense among member states. Would NATO really come to the aid of a Baltic state under attack? That's the question that Putin is interested to put to the test. Despite staggering losses in Ukraine, Russia's war economy is operating at full capacity. German intelligence reports that Moscow is producing more weapons than it needs for the Ukrainian front, suggesting that Russia is stockpiling for future engagements. Even as 75% of Russia's ground forces remain bogged down in Ukraine, its navy and air force are fully operational in the Baltics and on high alert. Once the war in Ukraine reaches a new phase or ends altogether, Russian troops will likely be redeployed to regions bordering NATO. At this rate, Russia will have all the necessary conditions for launching a full-scale war in Europe just within a few years. And what will the old Europe do next, when it's left to fight Russia on its own? Of course, not without Ukraine as part of the defense coalition, but still. And now we move on to Henry King's interview with Mr. Sherr, an expert and a friend of Ukraine. Let's go.
Mr. James Sherr, Senior Fellow of the International Centre for Defence and Security, Tallinn, Estonia. Mr. Sherr, thank you so very much for joining.
It's a pleasure being back with you. Thank you.
Craving some knowledge. Is Trump losing any influence in America by being unable to negotiate with Russia? Because he obviously is being unable.
I see no sign of that yet,
Right.
but there is sign that he is being buffeted by other things,
Like?
mainly of domestic character. Lots of negative indicators about the economy, not that any of them are drastic. The latest, the episode over the meeting, the Pentagon-hosted meeting regarding the strike on the Houthis, which either inadvertently or not included the editor of the Atlantic, and appeared to discuss classified and highly sensitive information, complete inconsistency of responses about all of this, what has been done, who is responsible. There are signs, albeit still indirect, of rising shock and, in some quarters, outrage at the scale and brutality of the wrecking ball style offensive launched by the entire administration against agencies of the US government and their employees. So all of these things are creating some resonances. And I think that's having a more immediate impact at the moment on the administration than what is taking place abroad. Just so your viewers understand, there are further ominous developments over Greenland, and I'm not sure of the latest status of it, but a high-level delegation, uninvited, has been due to descend upon the US airbase in Greenland.
Right.
It's not clear in what format this is going to go ahead, but what is increasingly clear to everybody is that Trump's statements, his declarations that Greenland will be incorporated in the United States and Canada will be incorporated as the 51st state of the United States, that these statements are not going away. They are becoming more strident. They seem to be very serious. And even in his meeting with Secretary General Mark Rutte, Trump's principal justification for what he was demanding in Greenland
So
was that
what
the
is
United
it,
States
Mr. Sherr,
needs
pardon me for interrupting, but is that really happening?
Yes, please interrupt.
Is that, yeah, first of all, can I please ask you to move a bit away from the camera because it cuts your head a bit? Yeah, great. And pardon me again for interrupting you. The question is, Greenland and Canada, 51st state, is that for real? Is that even possible? How he's going to do that? Because Canadians obviously are not really welcoming the decision, aren't they?
These things are really happening. The administration has shown so far a wanton disregard for the basic principles on which the international system has been built, at least under the United Nations. at least since the immediate post-war period, if not earlier. They've demonstrated profound ignorance. They do not seem to understand what the West means and why we call it the West. They do not seem to understand why the Russian system and Russian interests and objectives should pose any basic problem or any significant problem at all for the United States developing extremely friendly relations with Russia at all levels. And what is also abundantly clear that comes out of this is a lack of regard for and lack of respect for smaller powers, whether they are formally allied to the United States or not. And that, of course, conspicuously includes Ukraine. So there's an abundance of evidence internationally that Trump is dedicated to constructing a world order, the centerpiece of which would be centered on deals and understandings with the other two principal world powers, namely Russia and China. Smaller powers and existing commitments, even if these existing commitments have existed for 70, 80 years, are regarded with the utmost indifference and irritation.
Obviously.
And by the way, in this whole matrix, Europe itself is not regarded as a great power. It is regarded as a trading bloc, and at that, an adversarial trading bloc. So all of this is being absorbed in Europe. It's caused enormous shock, but it's also causing a reaction, and it's causing growing support for the view that Europe is going to have to make those efforts by stages over the long term and in a methodical and strategic manner to define and look after its own security interests, and including sustaining Ukraine in being as a viable and secure sovereign state.
Well, amen to that. But
So all of this is happening at once. It's very serious.
Right.
It's not being exaggerated. We won't have time to discuss it, but whenever I am not the most idealistic and optimistic person who deals with these matters, and whenever I set an expectation as to how bad it is and what to expect, the reality turns out to be worse.
thank you, Mr. Sherr. Now let's talk about something optimistic. Minerals deal. I mean, new minerals deal appears to be a pure extortion to me. I mean, should Ukraine accept it? Oh my God, this is the question.
Why? What is optimistic about this?
Nothing, absolutely. I'm just trying to keep in line, with your reality.
To establish some perspective again, we have had now almost concurrently 3 serious agreements under discussion. The so-called minerals deal, the so-called ceasefire in the Black Sea,
Right, so-called.
and the
indeed.
so-called ceasefire of energy. In each of these cases, each of them, what we see is the articulation of inconsistent and contradictory descriptions and explanations as to what is actually happening, who has agreed to what, and what the obligations are. In each case. Now, could I just start with this, the latest, in many ways,
Please.
most interesting, the Black
Please do.
Sea Agreement. This is being billed as a triumph of shuttle diplomacy. Well, let's understand what shuttle diplomacy is. Shuttle diplomacy, the principal party that has the ability to talk to both contending sides. So in this case, the United States, the principal party, and Ukraine and Russia on the other.
Right.
The United States, which of course has an interest, but is also a mediator, works separately with each side to build up a consensus to conclude an agreement. One agreement that each side understands in the same way, that is codified in the same way, and it entails the same obligations on each side. But here we see the opposite.
Absolutely.
Here we see a statement of objectives and principles concluded between the United States and Ukraine, and then a very different set of objectives and principles concluded with Russia. And then on top of that, because Russia is Russia, Russia insists that there are other provisions that are also binding and must take effect before anything else takes effect. And of course, Europe has not been consulted at all.
Right.
So this is the pattern of Trumpian diplomacy. And whatever its motivations are, the party that comes most under pressure in this, of course, is Ukraine. And President Zelensky is, of course, under enormous pressure to sign an agreement that has not been spelt out, that has been talked about in ways that are very ominous and very detrimental to Ukraine's interests, and completely advantageous to Russian interests. And he is under pressure. He's under pressure to sign something which is not fixed and clear at all. And my only hope is that he is being supported by Europe and being steadied by Europe and being encouraged not to give in to this pressure and to maintain his position and maintain Ukraine's fundamental interests.
Absolutely.
So that is that agreement. Now, then we have, a so-called agreement where there is no, we talk about an agreement, there is no agreement.
It is an extortion.
Then the energy ceasefire. Originally, Trump said that the United States' objective was to have an unconditional ceasefire,
Yes.
comprehensive.
Yes.
The Russians insisted it apply only to energy. A statement was issued that there would be a temporary ceasefire for 30 days covering energy and civil infrastructure. But the Russian statement omitted civil infrastructure, and the United States didn't object. And immediately attacks on civil infrastructure by Russia immediately were increased, and depending upon when you claim all of this started, attacks on an energy facility as well. So all of this has already fallen apart. Right. Now we get on to the minerals deal. Initially, Treasury Secretary of the United States visited Kiev, handed President Zelensky a surrender document and insisted it be signed immediately, and Zelensky said no.
Right.
So the United States then took away that document, produced a much more innocuous, much more bland, and of course far more acceptable framework document that in the end Ukraine agreed to sign. And now what has just happened is the Americans have filled in the details of that framework
Right.
document, and if they amount to Ukraine is being asked to accept, to give in to complete extortion. They do several things which would never have been accepted and weren't accepted in the first place. They build into this document that Ukraine is somehow obligated to reimburse the sum of military assistance provided since God knows when,
Exactly.
most of which was provided by a different administration, and not as a loan, but as a grant. And they are being obliged to pay that back from the so-called joint fund, which is in fact a US-controlled fund,
By the way.
that will, it turns out now, not only control mineral resources, but oil, gas, other resources unspecified from all parts of Ukraine, whether occupied or not. And the United States, according to this agreement, is free to set the terms and set how they are enforced.
Great.
And Ukraine is will only be entitled to extract any profit from this, if profit there is, only after all of these obligations for previous military assistance have been met.
Well, it seems to
So
me
that is where we are.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. I mean, I agree with you. But what happens if we are like between two fires? We're becoming either American vassals or Russian ones. But what if we decide to fight for sovereignty and that's it? Do you believe that Europe will
Well,
stand
the
for...
obvious question, the obvious question that needs to be posed
Is right, yeah, yeah.
is,
But then it is...
where does Europe stand? Where will Europe? What will Europe's role be in all of
Exactly,
this?
exactly.
Europe's consent is absolutely vital.
And should.
If Europe supports Ukraine, Ukraine is able to say no. If Europe insists, as it already has, and there have already been several statements, that sanctions are not going to be lifted on Russia until long-standing conditions are met, including Russia's complete withdrawal from all of Ukraine's legally recognized territories, then there will be, then there also is going to be no agreement with Russia. Europe has to make its presence felt. I know in various ways Europe is trying, the EU is trying to do this privately, the UK is trying to do this privately, but I think the EU must make its presence felt publicly.
Exactly my point.
Exactly.
I mean, you know, calling the coalition of resoluted or coalition of willing, maybe a coalition of acting is finally time to do something about it. Obviously, in the public sphere.
Yes, and what is needed, therefore, are very, very powerful voices who, in the end, are economically and even militarily more powerful than Russia, telling Ukraine, you must keep your nerve, and we are backing you, and we will not allow you to fail. These are the messages that need to come out of Europe. First, the key EU institutions, and then the non-EU states as well, the UK and Norway. And there is recognition of this across Europe, but
that much
you see,
is true.
all of this has been happening so quickly.
It is.
One of the reasons that all of this has been happening so quickly and has been planned to happen so quickly is to simply overwhelm the system, overwhelm the US constitutional system, its delineation and separation of powers, and overwhelm diplomatic institutions and EU and NATO diplomacy, so that there isn't time to react, so that everyone is too paralyzed to be able to pull together and decide how to go forward.
Well, Mr. Sherr, thank you so very much for this.
And the story develops every day.
Yeah, exactly. It was but the last question for tonight. I asked this question to everyone that I've been recently speaking to. So, do you believe any ceasefire is actually possible?
If you mean a ceasefire that will actually be observed for more than 25 minutes, no.
Right, yeah, well, all right.
There is one constant in this. Ukraine knows its national interest. They don't change every day. The EU has defined its own interests in a variety of ways over many years. They don't change every day. Those of us who have our feet on the ground, who know who we are, who know what our basic interests are, must be articulating those and make it clear that whatever noise comes out of Washington and whatever threats come out of Washington, we are not moving. And Washington hasn't heard that message from us before. And it's complicated by the fact that some of the people who matter, who agree with me completely, believe that we must be articulating this publicly and firmly in Washington as of now. And others, though, who agree with me, say, no, no, no. We must focus our efforts on trying to persuade Donald Trump and his administration
Nobody to persuade.
reconsider their position and be more constructive.
I don't
Now,
think.
my own view is that this second approach is based on illusory premises and assumptions. For everyone's sake, beginning with Ukraine, we need clarity and we need stability and resolution as quickly as possible.
Count me in for that, sir. Thank you so very much. Indeed, a nice journey. I completely agree with you. So if you ever need an advisor, I'm here for you. Mr. Sherr, thank you so very much. We definitely do that sometime in the nearest future again. Thank you.
As ever, although these are very unhappy times, it's a pleasure being on your program. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, sir. Goodbye.
Bye.
To wrap up, Ukraine's defense industry is proving itself as a global leader and possible exporter of technology. It could be a long-term security key. Ukraine's peacekeeping plan and European face huge challenges with Russia's stolen negotiations and European unity uncertain. Europe faces a real threat to face the Russian army on the battlefield even if the war against Ukraine won't be stalled. Huge investments are made into the Russian defense/offense complex. The coming weeks will be critical in shaping Ukraine's path forward. Will the West fully integrate Ukraine into its defense industry? And will a real peacekeeping plan take shape? Stay tuned, we'll keep you updated every step of the way. And thanks for watching, see you next time.